All right, come on in, everybody. Have a virtual seat. Welcome. And hello, everybody, and welcome to another presentation of the Online ColdFusion Meetup. I'm Charlie Earhart, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. And in this meetup, our 275th, being recorded on Thursday, November 5th, 2020 at noon U.S. Eastern Time, we've got TJ VanToll, who's going to follow up an earlier talk he did. This time he's going to do building great user interfaces fast with Kendo Ui. And I just want to remind you before we turn it over to him, if you look at the bottom of the screen there, you see the URL. All our sessions are recorded. So all the past 275 are still available going back to 2006. And some of them are still interesting, 15 years later, 14 years later. So check those out at recordings.coldfusionmeetup.com. And this one will be available right after the meeting in YouTube, and I'll also put it on that site. So with that, let's turn it over to TJ. Thanks again for coming on, sir.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks for having me. And I'll just switch over so you can see what I'm doing here. Yeah. So today we're going to talk about building great user interfaces fast with Kendo Ui. As mentioned, my name's TJ VanToll. I work as a developer advocate on the Kendo Ui team. And just to sort of set the stage of what I plan on talking about today, I'm going to start with a little bit of an intro. We'll do some slides just to set the stage of what Kendo Ui is, some sort of high-level information about the project. And then we'll spend the bulk of our time actually demoing and showing off some of these components, showing off what Kendo Ui can do in action. I'm a big proponent of just seeing code live as a way of sort of checking out what it is, what it can do, that sort of thing. And then we'll do any Q&A, any questions you might have. Feel free to ask the questions in YouTube really at any point. I'll stop and take a look to see if there's questions periodically throughout this talk. So get those in and we will go from there. So let's start with the intro bit and just some things that are important to know about Kendo Ui right off the bat. And the first is what it is. And this is my sort of simplest way of explaining what Kendo Ui is just a whole bunch of UI components. So just UI controls that you can drop onto your web applications. And as you see, there's a lot of them. And they're going to range everything from the basic things like a button to form controls like checkboxes, date pickers, drop-down lists, autocompletes, to really like fully featured components. So things like there's a full charting and graphing library built into Kendo Ui. You can even go up to components that you can almost build entire applications using just those components. So for example, our data grid is our single most popular component. And this thing alone has probably 100 some features built into it, from things like paging, sorting, filtering, some of the more standard stuff you might want to do with a grid, but all the way up to you can export your data to Excel. We integrate with that, with PDFs. There's a lot you can do, and we'll look at this control a little bit later on. Another popular one, another complex one is our scheduler. So you can use Kendo Ui to basically, if you wanted to replicate the calendar view in Outlook in your browser, we ship controls that can help you do that. We actually just shipped a Gantt chart. So there's some really complex, some really powerful things that you can do with Kendo Ui. But at its highest level, Kendo Ui is just a whole bunch of UI components that you can use in your apps. So that's thing number one, Kendo Ui, whole bunch of UI components. The second thing to know is that we provide these components for a number of different frameworks. So if you've been familiar with Kendo Ui, if you followed us, we actually launched back in, I think it was 2012 or 2013. We got our start as a series of jQuery plugins. And actually I came prepared today. I've got my jQuery headband here to wear. And those jQuery plugins are something that we still very much support to these days. We're actually adding new jQuery plugins. We have a lot of customers and users that are still using jQuery. So if jQuery is your jam, we still support those. For Angular and React, we provide these components as well. And for these two frameworks, actually, we provide components that are built specifically for those frameworks. So what I mean by that is our components for Angular and React, they're not just like the jQuery code that we like toss an Angular or React little API front end on. They're actually rebuilt from the ground up specifically for Angular and for React. And we do that both for performance reasons. We don't want you to have to ship jQuery when you're not using it, but also so that the components feel like they natively sort of belong, right? Our React components fit in a React ecosystem. Their APIs work like you'd expect them to work and whatnot. And I'll show some examples of this when we actually get into the coding part of this. And then finally, my last icon over here is Vue Js. Vue Js is the newest flavor that we offer in Kendo UI. And because this is new, this is one that if you looked at our Vue components today, some of them are using jQuery under the hood, sort of as a stopgap measure. When you have 80 plus components that you're writing from the ground up, as you might imagine, that takes a little bit of time. So right now we're using some of the jQuery code as like a stopgap until we have a time to, or have a chance to write those components using native Vue code. All right, so thing number one about Kendo UI, bunch of UI components. Thing number two, these components are available for a number of popular frameworks. So hopefully this is a framework you're using at your work or some of your personal projects that you're doing. So third thing to know about Kendo UI is that we are a paid offering. And you can buy KendoReact licenses either for individual frameworks, like for example, here's for React specifically, or you can buy Kendo UI as a bundle that includes all of the different frameworks. And that's actually a pretty popular thing. We have lots of companies that use Kendo UI and use it as a way of sort of standardizing the components they use throughout their organization. And the nice thing about that is that regardless of whether you're using React or Angular or Vue or jQuery, you can get a sort of consistent look and feel behind your applications. Because even though, as I mentioned, the components here are all sort of separate, built from the ground up specifically for those frameworks, there is some sharing across these. So for example, the themes that we use to basically control what the components look like, those are shared across all of these frameworks. So you could use Kendo UI as basically a way of standardizing the look and feel that you use throughout your organizations. And we have lots of customers and users that are using that today. And because we are a paid offering, we actually offer a lot more in terms of components or a lot in terms of features than you'd find for just sort of standard components you'd find around the web. And so I'll give you a few examples of these. The first is accessibility compliance. So this is something that's very important to us, mostly because it's something that is a hard requirement for a lot of the people that use our components. So we have a lot of customers that are in sort of government, insurance, the banking industries where accessibility is an absolute requirement for them to use any sort of framework. And so as part of Kendo UI, accessibility is very important to us. We offer guaranteed compliance for a lot of popular sort of specs that are out there. So things like Section 508, WCAG, YARIA, these things are built into our components. And if anything does come up with this, we treat any sort of accessibility issues with really high severity, just because that's something that's really core to what we do in Kendo UI. Another thing we offer with every license of Kendo UI is access to technical support. And if you're familiar with Kendo UI or Telerik, we're sort of an organization within Progress. We're kind of historically known for our support. It's kind of how we sort of made our name in the industry. And so with each license, you get access to our support ticketing system and phone assistance. And one thing that's, I think, kind of cool that we do is we provide support from the actual Kendo UI developers. So the same people that are writing the code are the people that help out with support when issues come up, which I think is kind of cool. And I think this is especially kind of neat for considering the complexity of things that we allow you to build with Kendo UI. So if you're using like an open source free date picker that you find out on the web and you run into issues, there's a decent chance you could just peruse around the web, find some sort of help for what you need, and probably get on with your day. But as you move on to the more complex stuff, as you're doing like complex data grids with production requirements, or you're doing into a full calendar system, charts, graphs, these are the sort of things that are not the easiest thing to Google for. They're not the easiest thing to get help with on something like free GitHub issues or Stack Overflow. And so it's one of the things that we think is an important offering to help basically you, the whole title of this talk, to help you build really powerful UI fast. And so the last thing on my list for Kendo UI is we also provide design language integration, or basically theming. So Kendo UI, basically, regardless of what flavor you use, has support for material design, for integration with Bootstrap. So if you're a Bootstrap person, we integrate with that really well. And we also have our own sort of built-in default language. So if you're not interested in any of those integrations, you can use the built-in one that we ship with out of the box. And we have an online-based theme builder that looks a little something like this, that basically lets you start with one of those three themes that we said earlier. So the default Kendo theme, or Bootstrap or Material. And then you get an environment where you can sort of customize little things, colors, to sort of meet the needs to control how these components look, to maybe meet your organization's internal style guide, look, feel, that sort of thing. So this is actually what the default theme looks like. This would be the Bootstrap theme. So you can see that's sort of the Bootstrap blue, and the material design theme as well. And we'll be playing with the material design theme today, so you can see some of the little animations and such that ship with this as well. All right, so that's the sort of high level picture of what Kendo UI is. Collection of UI components available for multiple frameworks, very themable, accessibility, compliance, support options if you get stuck in such. But to me, as I said earlier, some of this information is great. It's good to get like a little intro to it. But at least for me, the way I really learn something is actually seeing this in action. So I want to switch over to do a demo. I do want to see, I don't think there's any questions that have come in quite yet. So I will, now that I've got my development environment up here, I will have the questions, the Q&A panel up here on the side. So if you do have any questions, feel free to chime in, and I'll do my best to keep an eye on that and answer them. But for now, I want to actually show this off. And so I have my development environment, and just to sort of set the stage for what I'm going to be doing. So this is my editor. I'm a fan of Visual Studio Code, but you can use any editor with Kendo UI. And I've got sort of a scaffolded, basically an empty app. I've got a few little bits of boilerplate in here that's just going to make it easier for me to build a little bit quickly. So for example, I've got a Kendo UI drawer in here already that we can use to do a little bit of navigation. And I'll be adding different UI components to this to show you how Kendo UI works. And for this example, I'm going to be using React. I'm a pretty big React fan. That's the area of Kendo that I focus on primarily. But really, in general, what I'm going to be showing is applicable to Angular, to Vue, to jQuery. It's going to be the same basic workflow. Obviously, they'll be a little bit different in terms of the syntax and such. But don't worry about the React specific bits. We're not going to try to learn React today. I have to pick one at the end of the day. So we'll just use React for showing off these demos. And I'm going to be we're going to pretend we're from a fake mutual fund company here, Acme Stocks, very big name in the financial world, of course. And we're going to be building a little dashboard for their technology fund. And we'll show some information that's coming from sort of a mocked up backend API. All right. So that is the context. And so to get started, what I'll do is, so we're using the React flavor of Kendo UI. So in this case, I'm on Kendo UI or KendoReact.com. And the first thing you want to do, regardless of sort of what component you want to get started with, is go to the docs. And here's where you'll see the big list of components that I showed earlier on in the slides. And the first component I want to use is the panel bar, which I'll explain here in a minute. And the really great thing about Kendo UI is really when you go to use these components, you'll see that we have a really extensive set of demos that's available for all of these components. So it's really easy to go in and get a sense of what the components are, what are the different options that are available, what sort of configuration options you have available to you. For all of these, there is source. You can run these in StackBlitz, which is sort of a online environment where you can tinker with code. So if you see this and you go, I like this, but I want to tinker with it a little bit, you could just get it in StackBlitz real quick so you can tinker with it without necessarily having to get it working locally. So in this case, this panel bar is the first thing I want to add. This is a fake mutual fund, and mutual funds usually have sort of people that are in charge of them, like fund managers, financial people. And I want to show them in a little like accordion control on the left-hand side of the screen. And I'm going to use the panel bar to do so. So what I'm going to do is really your first step when using any of the components is to install them from NPM. So we make our components available on NPM, both for sort of ease of use and also to keep these things modular. So Kendo UI is a pretty big library in terms of there's a lot of components. So we want to make sure you're only shipping the code that you're actually using as part of your app. So in this case, you would need to install the panel bar from the KendoReact layout package, which NPM conveniently provides a little installation command here. So you go in here and you'd run this to install it and get it ready to use. And actually pre-installed this, so that should just take a second. And while that's running, because I'm going to also start up my development server, I'm going to bring up the code where I'm going to use this, because your next step, once this thing is installed, is to basically use these demos as a way of just figuring out how to use these components to build basically some UI for your app. So I'm going to start my development in server, which in React is typically done through npm run start. And then in this file, this is again where I want you to, don't worry about the React stuff. If you are a React person, great, you'll probably understand what some of this is doing. But really, all you need to know to understand this example is that this fund info is going to be a JavaScript object that is going to get some data. So basically, this is saying, get the data from the backend and then set this variable equal to that essentially JavaScript object data that comes back. And so I want to use the panel bar, and I've actually already imported the panel bar. So remember, we were getting this from the KendoReact layout package. And so down here, the first thing I want to do is use it. So in this case, I have it. I have the panel bar, which I'm going to use. And let me make sure. I might have to restart this. Yeah, I just had to restart it one more time. The panel bar item. And my panel bar item, in this case, I'm going to just basically taking some of the data from this backend and just sort of spitting it out there. And actually, I could throw a little bit more complex data so you can see what this looks like a little bit more. And the idea here, what Kendo UI is really providing you is, at least in my mind, solving the harder parts of dealing with some of these UI components. So for example, if you're building this app, you probably have an idea of what you want this bit of your app to look like. Maybe you have some design or some UI that you have in mind to build. But no developer really wants to deal with like the messy bits of like, oh, how am I going to make this positioned right? How I'm going to deal with things like expanding and collapsing. And so KendoReact makes that sort of thing for these really common problems that you run into as a web developer quite easy. So things like there's just a variable as to whether you want this expanded, right? Easy enough to just turn this off, make this collapse by default, and forcing people to actually open it up. And you can also do things like change the UI if you want to make it more obvious that this is expandable. You can even nest these things. So for example, I've got a second panel bar item, and you could put further panel bar items in it. So depending on what you might want. So for example, you could totally see yourself using this. I've seen this UI actually used. That was sort of the inspiration behind this on different financial apps. But I've also seen this sort of accordion type structure for things like support documents where you might have like high level topics and you might want users to get into more granular controls. And in general, what Kendo UI is trying to do for you is let you focus on the bit that's actually unique for your app and taking care of the hard parts of building this UI for you. And actually, I want to do one last thing before we leave this example. Remember how I said earlier that these are components that are built from the ground up for the specific framework? So in this case, Bruce saying, can't see the terminal. When I bring up the terminal again, yeah, because it's at the bottom of the screen, I'll make sure to bump up the font size a little bit. But remember how I said that each individual framework, we built these components from the ground up. One thing that allows you to do is take advantage of really the best of what frameworks like React and Angular have to offer, and without the components sort of getting in your way. And so I'll show an example of that. One thing I like to do in React, and again, the React specific syntax isn't really important here, is do a little trick like this. So in React, basically this is saying, if I don't have data that's back, let me show a loading indicator. And then another thing I can do is say for my panel bar, let me actually start this thing off with an opacity of, let's see, logic, right? If I have fund info, I want the opacity to be 1 to show it. So this will start off, when this is falsy, this will start off at 0. Essentially, I want this thing to fade in. So I show a loading indicator, data comes back, and the panel bar fades in. And what's cool about this to me, and I'll show more examples of this further on, is even if you didn't understand any of the React specific syntax, Kendo UI is not getting in your way. It's allowing you to fully customize the experience of your UI components to meet your needs while still solving some of the harder problems, like in this case, expanding and collapsing. And if you looked around here too, you could configure things like animation. You could tie routing into a panel bar. So if you had a panel bar again, like I'm thinking like the support thing where you had a bunch of different questions and you wanted to integrate that with your router. That's something you can do. Keyboard navigation and accessibility again. So I could move around this thing with my keyboard. I think it's enter to open and close it. So these are the sort of things that you get for free. And I see the source code on the left and browser view on the right. That what he's typing in the terminal. Oh, yeah, the terminal, I'm trying to basically behind the scenes, I've got a terminal running for running the app, but there's nothing necessary that needs to be seen there right now. So that's the panel bar. The panel bar, I wanted to start with a UI component that's a little bit simpler to give you the basics, but obviously the real power of Kendo UI is using the more complex components or things that are going to get you a little bit more in terms of functionality. So what I want to do next is switch to, we'll go to allocation panel here, because I want to use the KendoReact chart. So I'll again go back here. This is KendoReact.com. This is on the docs and demos section here. And I'll go to the chart. And in this case, you'll see that there's, again, an NPM package that I need to install. So I've already installed KendoReact charts to save us a little bit of time. And the same thing's going to be basically true. When you're on the documentation, you can sort of peruse around and get a quick glance at all of the things that the given component can do. And in the chart, you'll see that there's actually quite a bit. So for example, you can build, I think there's something like 14 different charts that you can build with KendoReact, some of which I'm pretty sure you need like a statistics degree to understand. I know what a lot of these do, but I still can't remember. Maybe I'm supposed to remember like things like a box plot chart, which I'm still not quite sure exactly what you need, but I know you can build it with KendoReact. Polar charts, which again, not totally sure, but you could totally do it with Kendo UI. But there's also the more common things that are the ones you probably need most often. So things like bar charts, pie charts, line charts, and whatnot. So we're going to start with a pie chart over in our application. And I'm going to throw a chart here in this sort of segment of the page. And you'll see that I said earlier, so I already NPM installed the KendoReact charts package, and I've already imported it on the top of my file. So those are my first two steps when using any component. And what I'm going to do is go down here and go ahead and paste in a little bit of starting code to actually use this chart. So in this case, okay, there we go. So I have a basic chart. The chart is taking some data that's coming from a backend. And basically it's saying, take that chart and render this thing as a donut chart. And a donut chart is basically like a pie chart where you just cut out the middle. I think I can just change this to pie if I wanted to see this rendered as a pie chart instead. And I think, yeah, so that would just work. So you kind of have some options in terms of how you render these things. But the power of Kendo, again, is just how easy you can get this sort of thing on the screen. So this is like 5 or 6 lines of code to make this possible. And then once you have this is where looking around and seeing what sort of features are available can be really powerful, because you can just really with any of these components, but this is going to be especially true of things like the chart, you can just look around and see the various things that you can do. So I have a couple here that I've prepped just to show you. So one thing you might want to do is show labels on your chart. So the exact numbers weren't showing up in this donut chart by default, but we provide a little component you can toss in here, chart series labels, that'll just make a label show up on the charts with some configuration options. You can change it to be to sort of look how you want it to look. You can change things like the legend. So you'll see that by default, Kendo UI produces a legend for this thing. You could either turn that legend off if that's something you don't want there, or you can configure things like where you want the legend to be. So in this case, I want to toss this on the bottom because in a minute here, I'm going to throw a second chart to the right of this. So I'm going to move this to the bottom just to give us a little bit more space. And I'll show off one more feature here, and then we'll look at a few more in the docs. I'm also going to throw a tooltip on here so that when the user renders this or when the user hovers over this, they can actually see, they don't have to rely on the legend. They can see specifically what it is they're hovering over. And notice that, again, don't worry about the React syntax, but what I have here is basically an extensibility option that's happening on this chart as well. So one thing you'll see, especially as we get into more complex examples here, is that in Kendo UI, one thing we've learned over the years is that developers, especially in more complex components, like the ability to configure just about anything. I don't know, maybe you watching this have had this experience, but there's nothing more frustrating than using some component you found on the web or whatever, and having some chunk of that component going like, oh crap, I really need this to be like slightly different, and it doesn't match my design or whatnot. And having to write like the messiest JavaScript ever to try to go in there and target that thing and switch it up and make it look how you want it to. So what we try to do on Kendo UI is provide basically like extensibility hooks in any place where we know developers might want to tweak things to meet their needs. So for example, this tooltip, by default, if you just use chart tooltip on your own, you get a really basic tooltip, but you also have a place where you can just create your own tooltip. So you could do a tooltip, like as if you've been following like the US political stuff, they use tooltips on their maps a lot. So you hover over a state and it shows up like a little box that shows like a breakdown of the different people and how many votes they get. So you could use this hook as a way of doing that, of building like a more complex tooltip. In this case, I'm just basically pulling out a single thing from my object, but I'll show an example, at least of one more complex thing in a minute. But this gives you an idea of how you could integrate and bring in some of this more complex stuff, and also customize it to meet whatever your business requirements happen to be. And as I said, the Kendo Ui Docs are basically the best place to go to sort of just look around and see what's available in terms of features. So for example, you could do things like panning and zooming. There's different types of panes. You can like highlight certain sections. So let's say you're building like a line graph and you wanted to show this is like the acceptable range. Those are things you can do. You can show crosshairs and different things as well. And I want to show one more example, and then I'll do a quick check to see if there's been any questions. So I want to add a second chart in here. So pie or donut charts are one common category of charts, but probably the most common category is either line or bar charts. So I want to toss that in here, and we'll go to this performance pane.
TJ?
Yeah.
While you're working that up, we're experiencing some sort of a challenge with seeing your VS Code. Like right now, it's acting like the right side of the VS Code panel is covered with something. And now, I don't know if others are seeing it, but people are saying it. And yes, at the bottom, we couldn't see. Like, there you go. Now we can see all the way to line 38. And it looked like you moved something to the left. So was there something on your end that maybe was blocking it?
There was.
We couldn't see what it was. It was just a block that was hiding it. But now we can see everything. What's
funny is I saw what you were referring to, and there is nothing blocking the way. So I'll try to keep an eye on there periodically. You can. It might have been I was scrolling fast or something, because now everything seems fine.
Right, and it had been like this for a few minutes back when somebody asked a couple minutes ago. And okay. I was waiting to see what they were talking about, and then I started to see it. All right, we're good. So you go ahead and keep going. Thanks, sir.
Yeah. If it pops up again, feel free to interrupt me, and I'll just slow down and figure it out. But I'll also glance over periodically. Cool. Okay. So I do want to show. So basically, I was going to add a second chart in here. So hopefully, we'll see if this works. I'm going to toss in a second chart, and you'll see that the API is pretty similar. So this mostly looks like the previous chart we used. But again, as I mentioned, there's a lot of different hooks for customizing these things. And I used a couple different ones here to provide just a slightly different look. So in this case, I'm using a chart series that's a line. And it creates, as you might expect, a line chart. And I'm also customizing the way the axis, or the axes, I guess this is singular, so axis looks. So I want to specifically control what shows on the x-axis of this chart. I could also control if I needed to customize. You see, I get a default look for the y-axis, but if I wanted to, like maybe I wanted to add commas in here, that's something that I could control as well. And you can also, so I have, notice chart series, there are ways that you can actually render multiple, like if I wanted multiple lines within this, I could do that. Or even like if I wanted a line chart and I needed to show some bars in here, or maybe I also wanted like an area chart in here. It's pretty easy to just granularly build up these components. Like from a UX perspective, you wouldn't want to do this. You don't want to throw a bar, a line, and area chart in a single place. But like if you had different data, depending on what your needs are, we've seen people building some pretty crazy stuff in terms of charts. And mostly what we're trying to do is provide options or different ways that you can construct whatever charts meet your needs. And like I said, there's lots of charts. I'll go back out here. I think I lost my context or I lost that tab. Different charts that are available out there that you can use. I'll highlight one more because I think they're kind of fun. We also do Sparkline Charts, which are basically baby charts. So if you might have seen this, I've seen this in some political coverage as well, where basically you have like a little inline chart that appears, and you have the ability to just toss those casually in your content, and they're actually fully featured charts. So that's another thing that we support as well. But just in general, I'd encourage you, like anything, when you have a component, head to the Kendo UI documentation, look around to see what the options are, and then sort of configure those to meet whatever your requirements are. And I'll also point out one last thing before we move on to the next example. So at this point, I've now added 3 of these different components, and I also have a drawer component that I sort of started this app with. And note how I didn't have to do anything to make these controls sort of look cohesive together. Right, all of these things are using the same theme out of the box. They've got the same sort of font and display and look good when used together. And actually, a lot of the one question I commonly get is, why does Kendo UI have things like a button component or like some of the more basic controls that we have? And the reason is because we really do want to provide this sort of all-inclusive experience where you can build UIs that by default, if you use our components, look good and also are accessible as well. So accessibility is not always a given if you find some random date picker component off the internet and whatnot. And so we try to provide a sort of comprehensive set of UI components that look good together, that work good together, and that are accessible as well.
Hey, TJ, before you go on to another thing.
Yeah.
So just, several minutes ago, a few minutes ago, you were making a change, whatever the last change was to that particular chart. What was the last thing that you changed? I'm just curious because we couldn't really see it.
Yeah, so I added a few different series.
Interesting. Yeah,
here.
We see those just all popped up now. For some reason, we weren't seeing any of that. So you just highlighted it, and I saw you highlight it. So it seems to be back to working. But then I'll just say, I don't know if you can see this, but like right there where it says chart series item, we don't see the C of chart series item. We just see heart series item.
It's really, really strange. I don't know. Should I try like stop sharing my screen and sharing it again?
Or what I wonder is, what if you switch to, instead of having these half one screen, half the other, just maximize VS Code for a moment and now hop over to the browser and maximize that? Because even when you were showing the demo of that second tab, stuff was kind of popping up, like half of what was on that tab was in the screen and half of what was in the tab behind it. And so right now I'm seeing it kind of still look
it still looks like it's kind of stuck,
like it's bleeding. Yeah, but how about just try minimize and maximize that browser? Sometimes that alone is enough to shake up the cobwebs.
Yeah, sorry, this is really strange because it looks like the connection seems totally fine. Like I still hear you and it's streaming just fine. It's just for whatever reason the display. I don't know what's up. It's
but
almost
if you
like
minimize and maximize it, I haven't seen that get done yet. I've seen that help sometimes. Something as simple as that. And I guess, are you on a Mac too?
I am on a Mac, yeah.
So all right, so that's that. So right now, there's a bit of a glitch over the word home, and over on the right we can see the word fun performance, and then to the right of that it's all kind of grayed out. So that's not so bad. But let's have you go back to Visual Studio Code and see. There you go. Whatever you just did, now we can see all of the page that was behind it. And now, I don't know about everybody else, but I'm seeing part of the graph bleeding through. Even though you've got VS Code maximized, I can still see the graph on the right. Do you see that at all, TJ? Because it would help to know if you see it.
I
if you don't see it. Okay, good. Okay.
It's not just me, and it's really strange because I don't know why
What could
that
be
would
causing it?
be
Yeah.
happening.
Right. Demo
Yeah.
gods.
Let me try it. So I'll
Always the
try one
demo
last
gods.
thing, and then if that fails, I'll just make sure to go slow. There's only a little bit more that I wanted to show
Sure.
anyways, so I'll just try stopping, sharing my screen again.
Not a bad idea too. Thanks, Preston. We're trying to get to the bottom of it.
Yeah, exactly. 2020 kicking in.
Yes.
Yeah, so let's try one more time. All right. So if we had my screen back, we could see if it works any better.
Oh, yeah.
It's basically just, it's like good old debugging tip 101, right? Like start it and stop it again and see see what happens.
So far, so good. Nope, there it is, bleeding again. Do you see it?
I do see it bleeding. Oh. Yeah, it's.
And this is stuff that if you weren't doing the StreamYard screen sharing, you don't think you'd see it at all, right?
I mean, it's hard to say. I haven't ran into this problem before. This is kind of weird.
Mm-hmm. When you did, was it while you were on a StreamYard video or even without StreamYard involved?
No, I haven't even seen. I've never seen this where it gets like really like has trouble redrawing it at all. It's really kind of strange because I don't think it's a performance or a bandwidth issue either. Sure.
And just so folks know, one of the reasons why I'm asking him about StreamYard is that he and Dan have been using StreamYard for a long time. So if he'd have seen this before, like, we don't want to go blaming them because they do this all the time, and this is not something he's seen before. So it is just one of these, weird things today. But there's nothing different. I mean, we're on the free version of StreamYard. You use the paid version. Maybe there's something there. I'm just trying to think diagnostically what could be the difference.
Yeah, I'll just finish up here.
Sure.
And basically, I'll assume that you're not seeing my screen very well and try to walk through here.
Right.
And we'll just do the best we can and just go from there. Because overall, like for the most part, my point overall is that really Kendo UI, what it mostly is, it's just a bunch of UI components that are just good individually, but also work in sort of a cohesive way. And the last one I want to show, and if my screen's janky and you can't follow everything, don't worry about it. I'll summarize the important bits to take home, is the grid. And I like to focus on the grid because it's our single most popular component. And I know it's janky, but you can see the bit where React Data Grid shows up here. And the grid is interesting. And actually, I'll post a link if you want to follow along. Since my screen's not great, I'll go ahead and paste in the YouTube chat so you can just sort of play with this on your own. Just because I think this is the components that's the most fun to play with. Because if you just look in terms of the raw amount of things you can do from the demo site, it's actually quite fun because it'll range everything from paging, sorting, filtering, the things you kind of expect a data grid to do, all the way up to things like virtual scrolling. So if you have a grid that has like hundreds of thousands of rows, you can render it and use it with KendoReact. You can export to things like PDFs in Excel, which is kind of cool. You can do inline editing. And so I'll try, if my connection will work here, try to show you a basic example. And if not, you can just use the link I pasted there to sort of play around with things yourself. But what I'm going to do is throw in a basic, not a chart. I'm going to throw in a basic grid. And you'll see here that hopefully you will see if it comes through that by default.
Well, right now we're the grid is blocked still by some of the graphs. So if you could close that second tab, I wonder if that would make it go away.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see if that works. If not, yeah, it's sort of weird. I'm actually sort of fascinated by exactly how this is doing this because it's giving like strange artifacts. All right, there we go. We see the grid now. So the grid by default, and so that's what the code looks like. Again, like all the Kendo UI components we've been looking at, pretty simple syntax to import in, build something that's fairly powerful. And in this case, and I'll wait for this to show up on the screen as well. The default appearance of the grid is basically going to be like an HTML table. So you get an HTML table that looks basically like the rest of your app. And actually, I think like not only is this thing like an artifact, it's also on a bit of a delay as well. But you have to take my word for it. It looks a little bit like an HTML table, but from there you can add on basically a whole ton of stuff. And so one example I want to show, and I'll try to at least somewhat talk through it, because one of the things, especially on the grid, is we want to allow people, again, to be able to customize each and everything about this. So you can customize how the header cells work. If you're doing paging, you can control exactly how that UI works. If you're doing filtering, you can control that. Really, everything you see is customizable and changeable. So I'm going to try, I'll use words to try to explain what I'm doing, because I know this won't come through the greatest. But one thing I want to do is in this table, I have cells for showing how much. These are stocks that are in the cells. And I have two columns that show how much a stock has changed. Like, has it went up? Has it gone down? And what I want to do is color those to be either red or green based off of up or down. So a pretty common thing that you might need to do in any sort of financial app. And in KendoReact, one of the things you can do is use our extensibility APIs to implement this sort of thing. So in this case, I will give this a cell prop. So it's basically one of the options on the individual cells that you can do to control how that cell is going to be rendered. And you can maybe kind of see it. I think some of it's coming through. And what that allows you to do is, this gets back to my point earlier about us trying to make the best of React, what React has to offer, because React is really good at letting you write just little really lightweight components to customize how your apps look. So in this case, I'm going to write just a little bit of code that lets me spit out a cell that's either going to have a class name of change up or change down to control whether that cell shows with red or green text. And basically just showing this as an example of how KendoReact lets you customize each and every little bit of this. And you can see how I'm customizing it. That part's coming through. So this is a data cell. And basically at this point, I have complete control. Like if I wanted to show the fire emoji in here, because that's my business requirement, I could totally do that. I could render things completely different if I wanted to, or I could just make the small little tweaks that I want to meet the needs of my app. And you're not actually seeing the render of this. So, but basically, all I'm trying to show is that even with our more complex components, you have complete control over exactly what you want to render. And really, that's just sort of the idea in general. And this is something that holds true for all of our different UI components that are out there. So Kendo UI is really a great fit anytime you need some of these controls. And so if you just straight up, I need a data grid and I need a powerful data grid, Kendo UI is worth checking out. But even as a broader point, if you just need, and I'll try to get the app itself to render by minimizing it and maximizing it such. Where I think Kendo UI is a really great fit, though, is when you're looking for a set of components that you can trust for your organization to both work, to be accessible, to stick around, and to also provide a sort of consistent look and feel. So you don't have to try to go around the web and find a date picker, and then also find a date picker that works with the autocomplete that you found, and then that works with the drop-down list and a chart and a grid. It's an all-inclusive package for your organization to solve your UI needs. And I promise you, it looks better than the sort of garbled mess that you're seeing on the screen right now with the grid. So I pasted in a link to the grid earlier. That's one you can check out. I'll also just paste in a link real quick here to the putting in here just the general components page. That's the best place to go in and just sort of explore. You can see some of my screen now. There's a number of fully featured sample applications. So there's a stock picker, there's a dashboard app, there's one that's focused more on the data grid. Those are ones that are worth just sort of scoping out to see more of a real world-ish example of what KendoReact can do. And they're all open source, so you can grab the code for any of this as well. So that was my demo. That was really, so there's a few other things that are going to be hard to show with my screen sort of being choppy and such, but that's the general premise of Kendo UI. And I pasted in a link that's a great place to go if you want to explore further. And I'll also throw in a link to the sample app. So if you want to grab any of the source code that I've been showing today, you can do that as well. That's most of what I want to show. And I apologize for the issues with streaming, because that was kind of weird, but hopefully you can get a high level idea of what Kendo UI can do. Does anybody have any questions? And I'm sorry if I missed them earlier.
There weren't any questions that you haven't answered yet. No. About the link, though, I'm not seeing it. Preston said he doesn't see it. I'm looking in both StreamYard and in YouTube, and I'm not seeing it. Did you perhaps, if you look at YouTube, maybe it's set to share it with some individual instead of to everybody?
I should have it in YouTube. Let me open like a private tab to see if I see it there.
Demo demons.
Yeah, this is really weird. I see my original comment, but the links aren't coming through either.
Oh, you know what? No, because links are they get blocked.
Oh, they block links.
Yes, YouTube does that. Okay. Now let me see. Well, I'll tell you one thing you can do. Yeah, it doesn't seem like I can manage that, but what you can do, what I do with this situation, is just take off the protocol in front. So just put, the www, whatever it is, and then it comes through fine. And it's really a bummer that they don't pop up and tell me, hey, here's a chat comment that we're waiting to send through, but it doesn't appear like there's any sort of.
We'll see if they're smart enough. Otherwise, I need to. Looks like it might have actually blocked the one with the no protocol even. Yeah, I think they've gotten smarter, because really? I pasted it in just Telerik.com and that didn't work either.
That's terrible.
So we've got to outsmart the robots again, I think, to
my goodness,
get these things through.
Right. So
I'm wondering if you as the
yes,
you have enhanced rights, because I can toss them in the chat in StreamYard, and then
can you though? Oh, right, in that chat, the private chat. Yes. Good thinking. Yep, there you go. I got that.
So I'll grab this
one that's ends in components.
Yep, and then this will be the second one that I'll paste in right now. And those are the two that'll be the best places to go to learn more about Kendo UI, to sort of explore it. And then the second one will be the source code. So if you want to see what I was doing today and see it without the screen artifacts, you can check that out.
And while we're waiting for people to check those things out and look at them, you may have addressed this back at the beginning. I might have been doing some housekeeping stuff. All these elements, all these things get data, I assume, from like any JSON data stream.
Yep. Yeah. There's certain elements in here to help, like sort of. That's actually another thing that's shared across the different flavors of Kendo, is working with data. And there's even some specific integrations, like you can maybe see some of the different integrations that we offer. But in general, usually like the options will have like a data property or attribute that you provide in, and that data can come from anywhere. So if it's coming from a backend, that's great. It's a little more advanced for things like the grid or like the scheduler, because sometimes you might want to have a grid where, it directly integrates with your backend. Like I hit the next page and then the grid automatically knows, oh, I need to grab the next 10 items, or sorting would be another one that you might have to call the backend to actually do the sorting logic or the filtering logic. So it sort of depends on the component, but in those situations, there'll always be some sort of demo that'll show you the exact sort of structure that you need to use to make that possible.
But as for the others that are more generic, you just would send them some stream of data and they will try to graph it as best they can based on interpreting what looks like columnar or tabular data, but presented as a JSON stream, right?
Yeah, so like for the grid, by default, if you just passed it for data, just like a JavaScript object, it's going to try to be intelligent about it and say like, oh, let me grab like the property names and throw those up. But then there's also options where you can essentially make it smarter, right? You could tell it,
sure.
Here's what I want the title, like the display title to be.
That I'm saying other than the grid, for the more simple things like graphs and stuff like that, I just want to help everybody to understand that, because I don't think you demonstrated it. this could all be used with ColdFusion. This is the ColdFusion user group. We should
Yep.
make this clear. It can all be used with ColdFusion because ColdFusion can send a stream of JSON data many ways. There's ways to serialize, a query, serialize a struct, serialize an array. There's ways to send various JSON data yourself. There's tools that can convert those into things that are more generically useful for tools like this. So I'm just, we didn't talk about any of that here at the top of the talk, but I suspect, like if you look on the right, there's links there for using it with .NET, using it with scripts. There wouldn't be anything that would say using it with ColdFusion, but often we CF people can look at examples of how something shows integrating with PHP or Node or whatever, and can go, okay, we can do the same sort of thing. I just want to make sure everybody listening understands, because sometimes people they come to these meetups and they don't know that sort of stuff. They're just here to learn whatever we may have to say. So we don't want to presume that they already understand that.
Yeah. I should have spelled that out in more detail earlier on, but basically Kendo is just helping you. I think what's kind of a good thing about Kendo UI is, in general, it's just helping you build the actual display part, the front end bit, which means it can work with quite literally any backend, right? It's just all it needs. You need to get it JSON somehow, and how you do it. If it's ColdFusion, great. If it's PHP, sure. If it's coming from some sort of .NET backend, as long as you can get data to the controls, then they can sort of solve the UI problems for you. But that does mean that, like, lots of times there's no, like, sometimes we don't necessarily directly integrate with backends either. So it's sort of on you to get us the data, however it is you have your backend oriented or set up.
Very good.
Any other questions?
Took the words right out of my mouth. I was literally about to say the same. And there hasn't been any since Preston's last comment.
Okay.
So, and it doesn't show either. Some tools let us see when someone's typing. So if anybody's typing a long question, you might want to cut it to your clipboard and say, yep, I got one coming. Yeah. Otherwise, we're going to presume that you don't have any coming, and we'll let TJ get on with the rest of his day. And others who may be wanting to either go to lunch or get back to work, depending on their time zone.
Or to not get back to work. It's pretty nice. It's pretty nice here. I'm thinking about not working for a bit.
Yeah, where are you? I'm
in Michigan, and for some reason we've had a ridiculously warm couple of days. Like,
right, we did too here I'm in Southern Kentucky.
Okay.
Out of the blue, really nice. Take advantage of it, but I'm sure it's going to be cold here and there very shortly. Yeah, it was the other day.
We had little bits of snow last weekend. Yes. And yesterday it hit 70. I didn't know what to do with myself. It's kind of nuts.
Yeah. And for anybody who says, oh, that's just another sign of changes, I'll just say, no, I've been living long enough. There's been warm Octobers and weird, Indian summer, right? Isn't that what I think the phrase is used? Suddenly a couple warm days out of the blue, and then back to winter. So it's perfectly normal, typical stuff. But anyway, well, so it looks like, there's no particular questions, just people saying thank you. And I'll say that as well. Thank you very much, TJ, and people check those things out. And why don't you share, I didn't catch if you did, your, how people would reach you best.
Oh, yep. Yeah. I only had it up for a brief second. Oh, I said play. Well, I'll just leave it on this. Yep, TJ VanToll. I'm consistently TJ VanToll everywhere. So
good for you.
Twitter's probably the best. It's nice about having a non-common name, right? Like,
right, exactly.
Tends
like
to
me
be
with Carhartt. Yeah, absolutely.
Yep, it's
do you take DMs directly or?
Yep. Yeah. So if you do have any further questions, really you can find me TJ VanToll anywhere, but DMs and Twitter is the best, and I'll be the most responsive there at least.
Excellent. All right, cool, man. Well, thank you very much. And again, everybody, this has been recorded. As soon as we're done, it'll be available. You're already watching it, but tell your friends. It'll be available on YouTube at the same link you're looking at right now. And we'll get news out shortly of a session for next week. And TJ, until the next time, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, sir. Talk to you later.
Yep.
And thanks, Dan, for setting it up. See ya.